A narrative story from the perspective of the centurion at the cross of Jesus. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion, who stood there in front of Jesus, heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Mark 15 verses 37 to 39 NIV. Some days are just so intense, so emotional, so different than what you expect, that you never forget them. You never want to forget them. It was that kind of day for Claudius. In fact, it was an intense day at the end of an intense week. It was Passover in Jerusalem. Claudius was a centurion in the Roman regiment assigned to maintain the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, in Jerusalem. It was not easy, especially at Passover. Over 100,000 Jewish pilgrims came into the city for Passover, swelling its occupation many times. The Romans were greatly outnumbered, so keeping things calm was no easy task. While the Roman Empire was vast, encompassing many diverse countries, cultures, and peoples, the Roman method for keeping the peace was the same everywhere: walk loudly and carry a big sword. In other words, let your presence be seen and felt. And, if necessary, put on a show of force to intimidate and deter anyone who entertained ideas of rebellion. Otherwise, one spark and a fire could erupt. Claudius was what you and I might call a career soldier. He had joined the Roman army as soon as he was old enough and worked his way up to the rank of centurion. That means he was the commanding officer over 100 other Roman soldiers. Join the army and see the world. To Claudius, it seemed that most of the world he had seen was made of sand. His latest assignment was Israel, where he worked under the command of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. He was a good soldier, trained to obey his orders, which is exactly what he did. And on occasion, the order he received was to carry out a crucifixion. Crucifixion was a dirty, rotten business. Claudius had worked his first one when he was just a private. His stomach was not ready for the sound of the crack of the bone, the spewing of blood, and the cries of anguish. Crucifixions were designed to be the most humiliating and degrading of all deaths. In fact, Roman citizens were never executed on a cross. They were beheaded. That is not pleasant, but at least it was instantaneous. During that first crucifixion he worked, Claudius could not stop himself from throwing up. By the time he found himself in Jerusalem for Passover, he had executed several dozen crucifixions. Honestly, after a while it did get easier, but it never got easy and he never got totally used to it. He had just reported in for duty at the Fortress Antonia on Friday morning. Sunset that day would mark the beginning of Passover, and the city would return to calm. One more day of Claudius roaming the streets, riding his horse, showing that strong Roman presence, and the hard week would be finished. But it was not to be that simple. As Claudius was approaching the Fortress Antonia to report for duty on Friday morning, he heard the sound of a crowd coming down the street toward the residence of the governor. Recognizing that it was far too early for such a large number to be moving through the streets even during Passover, he quickly made his way up to Pilate's home to see what was happening. When Claudius got there, a crowd was already gathering out at the entrance. He asked one in the crowd what was happening. The stunned man replied, "Jesus, the teacher, the prophet from Galilee, has been arrested. The chief priests are going to ask the governor to crucify him." By the time Claudius got inside, a dialogue had already begun between the Jewish leaders and Governor Pilate. Pilate had to come out to the gate where the Jewish leaders awaited after delivering Jesus to him. They would not come inside the residence because it was a holy week for them, and to enter into the home of a non-Jew would in some way damage their spiritual status. Claudius knew Pilate well enough to conclude, accurately, that he really did not enjoy the conversation in which he was engaged. When Claudius got close enough to hear some of the talk, Pilate was saying, "I find no fault with this man." At that moment, Claudius figured that Pilate would send them away and it would all be over quickly. Instead, with amplified intensity, the charges against this Jesus were restated. He stirs up the people all over Judea. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. Luke 23 verse 5. When Claudius got close enough to hear some of the talk, Pilate was saying, "I find no fault with this man." At that moment, Claudius figured that Pilate would send them away and it would all be over quickly. Instead, with amplified intensity, the charges against this Jesus were restated. He stirs up the people all over Judea. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. Luke 23 verse 5. When Galilee was mentioned, Claudius saw Pilate's eyes light up as if he had an idea. If he is from Galilee, then let Herod deal with him. Then noting Claudius' presence, Pilate gave him orders, take him to Herod. Quickly Claudius dispatched several of his men to take the man called Jesus to see Herod Antipas, the governor of Galilee. Herod just so happened to be in town to observe Passover. After the soldiers led Jesus in the direction of where Herod was staying, the religious leaders all trailed along behind. But all too soon they were all back. The soldiers reported that, amid the accuser's shouts and Herod's questions, Jesus had stood in silence. Herod had quickly grown tired of the whole business and sent Jesus back to Pilate. When he got the news that they were back at his gate again, Pilate clearly was agitated by the whole affair. With a new resolve, Pilate again went to the gate, faced the religious leaders, and declared that now neither he nor Herod had found anything in this man that was deserving of death. But, in the hope that the crowd would be satisfied with some punishment, Pilate ordered Claudius to have Jesus scourged. Again, Claudius gave an order and, as was customary, the soldiers took Jesus and bent him over a low stump and exposed his back. Then a private skilled in whip started his work. This particular type of whip had numerous strands, and the end of each strand was studded with bits of sharp rock or bone. Each blow lay heavily across Jesus' back with the chips of bone and rock digging into the flesh only to rip more skin when they were pulled out. In a word, it was torture. With each snap, even hardened Roman soldiers watching flinched in recognition of the pain inflicted. Sometimes weakened men would die from scourging alone. Yet, unlike so many others, this Jesus did not cry out in anguish nor beg them to stop. When 40 lashes, save one, was through, what was before Claudius and the others was a bloodied and beaten Jesus. Claudius thought, surely the sight of Jesus in this condition would satisfy the appetite for blood from the crowd at the gate. But their grumblings clearly indicated that they were neither satisfied nor persuaded to leave. So Pilate called Claudius over and gave another order, fetch me Barabbas. Only his strict military training and experience kept Claudius from reacting in disgust. Barabbas was a notorious man, a terrorist who gave the Roman soldiers no small amount of trouble before he was finally captured. He was scheduled to be executed later that day, and, to be honest, Claudius would not be sad to be rid of him. When he arrived with Barabbas, it was obvious that Pilate had something in mind. Every year Pilate would release a prisoner during Passover. It was some kind of diplomatic offering to appease the wrath of the crowds. Personally, Claudius hated it. When he returned with Barabbas, Claudius began to see Pilate's thinking. He brought out Jesus too and offered the crowd a choice. Even Claudius thought he could live with this. Surely the crowd would choose Jesus, the man with whom there seemed no serious charges, as opposed to the criminal Barabbas. But as Pilate presented the option, to his shock, Claudius heard the chants, away with this man, release to us Barabbas. Pilate, clearly bewildered, asked what was on Claudius' mind. Why? What crime has he committed? What evil has he done? Yet they shouted all the louder, crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate, clearly frustrated, told the chief priests to deal with Jesus themselves, repeating again that he found no fault with the man, John 19 verse 6. But they appealed back, saying that according to their laws, Jesus should die. But they had not authority from Rome to perform an execution. Clearly taken, Pilate took Jesus back into the praetorium. While they talked, Claudius checked out his men guarding the gates. Outside, he sensed some kind of strategy was being plotted by the chief priests to finally pressure Pilate to get Jesus to do what they wanted. When he emerged, they made their final play to force Pilate's hand. If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king is a rival of the emperor. Jesus was brought out. Pointing to him, Pilate said, "Behold your king." And the rustle in the crowd quickly exploded into a frenzy. "Away with him! Away with him!" they shouted. Pilate responded, "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. And to Claudius' amazement, he heard them say, "We have no king but Caesar." Time and again in dealing with these Hebrews, they expressed bitter resentment that they were ruled by Caesar. They resisted the Roman presence tooth and nail. And now they were declaring their allegiance to his emperor. They really did want Jesus dead. Pilate knew well if word got back to Rome that he had been easy on one even accused of being a threat, his career was in jeopardy. Claudius could see, like an athlete conceded to his opponent, it just wasn't worth the fight any longer. He ordered Barabbas released, then turned to Claudius and said, "Take this Jesus and add him to today's crucifixion." As he did, Pilate washed his hand in front of the crowd and announced, "I am innocent of this man's blood. He is your responsibility." The crowd had no problem with that, saying back, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Claudius asked Pilate, "Sir, for the official record work, what are the charges?" Pilate, in getting in the last word, said just right. "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The men of my regiment decided to have a bit of cruel fun with this Jesus. It was a game the bored soldiers often played with a condemned man where they would mock him as if he were a king. With the Jesus character actually accused of claiming to be a king, the temptation to scoff at him took on even greater intensity. An old purple robe, the color of royalty, was draped across Jesus' back. A thorn bush nearby was quickly utilized to create a crown of thorns that was pressed upon his head. Then, the soldiers bowed before him with exaggerated gestures acclaiming him as King of the Jews. All the while they were spitting on him and hitting him both with a staff and their fists. John 19 verse 3. Claudius regretted letting it go on so long before he ordered, "All right, soldiers, that's enough." He watched as this man, this Jesus, took all this ridicule without the slightest bit of revolt. He was calmer than any condemned man he had ever seen. He began to see how different Jesus really was. The heavy beams of 3 crosses were laid across the backs of those to be crucified. Claudius was eager to get through the narrow streets of the city, outside the gates, and to the place of execution the locals called Golgotha. The intensity and close confinement of the city made this walk the place where trouble was most likely from the crowds. Claudius led the way on horseback. It was a slow walk in good conditions, but the sheer number of people and the fact that the one called Jesus was so fatigued and weak made it even slower. Finally, it was necessary to order someone from the crowd to carry his cross for him. Upon reaching the place of crucifixion, Claudius watched as the solders under his command went about their tasks. They knew them well. They had performed these often enough. It already felt like it had been a long day, but looking up into the sun, Claudius figured it was only about 9 o'clock. Crucifixion was designed to be a slow, painful, smothering death. Knowing that, Claudius sighed as he thought, "This is going to take all day." Again, Claudius noticed something different about Jesus. He had seen many a man fight and struggle to their last ounce of strength as he was nailed to his cross. But not this one. With remarkable calmness, Jesus almost voluntarily accepted his fate. After all 3 crosses were stood up and mounted into place, the long wait began for those executed to become so weak they could no longer pull air into their lungs. In the meanwhile, Claudius allowed the soldiers to pursue their own amusements. They took the discarded clothes of the ones being crucified and divided them up. They would either find personal use for this cloth or sell it to someone. Jesus' outer garment was nicer, so they threw dice to determine who would claim it. At that moment, they were much more focused upon the roll of the die than the pain and suffering going on just above their heads. Never before had Claudius seen people actually mocking a man being crucified. "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." Others cried, "He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now." Matthew 27, verse 43. Still others mocked, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself." They even went so far as to say that if he really was who he said he was, he would climb down off the cross. But of course, he could not do that. After all, he was just a man, or so it seemed. Throughout the day, Jesus raised his head to speak a number of times, and Claudius never forgot his words as Jesus looked down at him with what can only be described as a look of love and said, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Claudius was used to hearing curse words, not forgiving words. When he could muster up the strength, Jesus continued to offer remarkable concern to his mother and even to the one being crucified next to him. More and more Claudius knew this Jesus was not ordinary, but extraordinary. Around noon, an eerie darkness came over the whole sky as if something was blocking out the sun's light. A disturbing quiet accompanied this until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Then Jesus raised his head and cried, "My God, My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Soon afterwards, Claudius heard Jesus shout one last time, "It is finished. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And he bowed his head and died. Claudius always thought that the sound of these words was not in defeat, but in victory. Somehow he knew that this was no defeated man. Suddenly the ground began to shake as if a great earthquake were upon them. Frightened people began to run frantically. It was all Claudius could do to stay upright on his own feet. It was at that point that Claudius took a long, hard look at the cross and knew and said the only conclusion his heart and mind could make. Surely this man was the Son of God. As Good Friday and Easter Sunday approaches, one of the best ways for a follower of Jesus can redeem those days is to spend time taking a long, hard look at the cross and remember the price that Jesus paid to restore what our sinful rebellion destroyed in our relationship with God.